Welcome. This is a video for the overview module of Linguistics 101. In this video, we're going to take a whirlwind study of the different areas within linguistics. We're going to focus on the 5 areas that we cover in this course. That's semantics, phonetics, phonology, morphology, and syntax. But we'll also have a quick look at some of the other ways of dividing up the field of linguistics, the discipline of linguistics. So there is this general question about whether language is one thing or several things. Now we are going to talk about it as several distinct things because that's a nice convenient way of breaking it down and learning a bit at a time. But there is an active question out there as to whether language really has distinct modules in our brain, maybe different sections of the brain deal with different aspects of language, or some other kind of functional division, or whether it's this big mess of stuff all happening at once, all sort of one gestalt process that it's only conceptually useful to divide it up. It's an interesting question, but not one that we're going to get into the weeds on here. Excuse me. So we'll start with those 5 modules that are going to be the focus of this course. So in terms of describing the act of speaking or the act of listening and understanding, there's 5 main questions that we can look at. This is how we can divide things up. We can ask how meaning works. We build meanings in different ways from smaller bits of meaning. We relate meanings to each other in various ways. There's a lot of stuff in just how meaning works as part of language. We can also ask about how speech sounds work as a physical event. Moving our muscles and our parts of our vocal tract to make the sounds. We can ask the other end of it, hearing. Like how does the physical process of transforming sound waves into neural signals work? We can also look a little bit more abstractly at how the sounds of speech pattern together in a language. How we can look at how we build words out of bits. How we have these sort of little bits of pronunciation that have meaning with them, and how we can build larger words out of that, and how we can build sentences out of words, right? Now, these questions, I've sort of phrased them as distinct questions, but there's a lot of overlap. Some of the bits of overlap are fairly obvious. Some of the bits of overlap will kind of sneak in by the back door as we're learning through. I'll try to highlight these as we cover things. But yeah, anyway. So let's have a brief look inside each of these 5 main questions. So the question of how meaning works, that's a question of semantics. So semantics is it's a field that is a field within linguistics. It's also, the study of meaning is a field within philosophy and other areas as well. And it's a rich and deep area of study, and encompasses a lot of aspects of how we attach sense to the sounds of the words that we speak, to the gestures that users of sign language use, all of that. In this course, we're going to focus on some broad aspects of the structure of meaning. We're going to relate meanings to one another. We're going to connect meanings to the real world and to our internal understanding of concepts. We're going to analyze a little bit of the internal structure of meanings, and we're going to discuss a bit about ambiguity in meaning, not only how it's difficult, but how it's useful. Now, the physical facts about the sounds of language, that's the area of phonetics. In phonetics, phoneticians look both at production and perception, and also at acoustics, the physics of sound transmission itself. In this course, we're mainly going to focus on speech production, and specifically describing consonants and vowels in terms of how they're produced, representing them using the International Phonetic Alphabet, and learning to transcribe English words, Canadian English words, using it. Phonology that's the field that deals with patterns of sound. So you can see how that's obviously very closely connected to phonetics, but phonetics is the physical facts of speech. Phonology is the patterns and a certain amount about the abstract representation of these sounds in our minds. In this course, we're going to look at describing and analyzing sequences of sounds, especially syllables, one of the sort of key organizing units of pronunciation. We're going to look at identifying relationships between similar sounds based on actual data, sets of pronunciations exhibited in languages. And we're going to look at some reasoning and inferential work around looking at interactions between these patterns that we're investigating. In talking about the structure of words from bits of words, this is the subject matter of morphology. And in this module, first we're going to... The morphology module in this course is the point where we start to systematically really bring together meaning, the subject matter of semantics, and form, that's phonetics, phonology, the pronunciation. Meaning and form come together in various places, but morphology is one of the places where they really do sort of become one. We're going to look at things from the question, what is a word? A question that can be a lot more complicated than it seems at first. And what are the other bits of meaning that make up words? We'll look at analyzing the internal structure of English words, discovering patterns in sets of data from other languages, so discovering the morphological structure and components, root words, affixes, and whatnot, if we have a bunch of data from any language. And we'll look at a bunch of different ways that you can form new words in any language. Okay, and the fifth area that we're going to look at in this course is the study of phrase structure, sentences and other phrases, and that's the study of syntax. Syntacticians, they have so much different material to work on. Languages vary a whole lot. They vary a lot in all of these different fields. Certainly in syntax, it's one of the parts of language structure that we can be most conscious of, and yet it can vary as much as any other part. So if you think that sentence structure makes sense in English, which you may or may not, depending on how much you've thought about it, it doesn't necessarily look that way in other languages. Now, in this module, we'll look at identifying different types of phrases, drawing trees to reflect their structure, their internal structure, identifying key roles of phrases in a sentence, and comparing languages in terms of their typical word orders, and a few other bits. A lot of little patterns within syntax that we can get our teeth into. At the end of this course, you should be able to analyze and describe patterns in each of these 5 areas: semantics, phonetics, phonology, morphology, and syntax. Now, there's a lot of other areas of study within linguistics. One of the first areas of study, the earliest academic linguists back in the 18th and 19th century were called philologists, and their main area of investigation was the history of languages. How did languages get to where they are from where they were? How did we get today's languages from the languages of our ancestors? Historical linguists study how languages change over time. They investigate it in such a way as to find general patterns and use those patterns to reconstruct past versions of a language. Not only in cases where we have archaeological evidence, written forms, say, of those past languages, but in instances where we don't. All we have is the contemporary languages that have descended from an original language, and they can compare them and sort of work back. So that's a fascinating area. Language acquisition is another area, one of the more practical areas to study. How do kids learn language? First language acquisition. How do you learn your first language? When you don't have a language already, you can't say, oh, I'm learning this language, I'm going to find out what their word for table is, or what their word for nose is, or whatever. You can't do that if you don't already have a language. How do kids learn language? What patterns do they follow? Is there a set sequence that they follow? Are there ages at which, normally developing children will have this level of competence or that level of complexity or whatever? And of course that can be used to diagnose and to a certain extent treat children who don't follow that typical sequence for one reason or another. And second language acquisition. There are people as a separate but obviously related area of study. How do you learn a second language? there's some patterns that are very similar to the patterns of first language acquisition, and there's some things that are very different because suddenly you have another language that can be influencing the new language you're trying to learn. Psycholinguistics is a study that uses psychological behavioral research techniques to investigate the cognitive processing of language. So we can not only see how language fits into the more general area of human behavior, but we can use these processes to dig into the nuts and bolts of how we process language as human beings. Neurolinguistics is an area that studies the actual physical structure of the brain as it relates to language. Sociolinguistics, that's a really fun area where you can study social patterns in language. How do I speak differently to my students versus to my children or to my friends, right? How do you speak differently from how I speak? And how does the way we speak identify us in terms of our not just linguistic background, but our social background and the identity that we wish to consciously adopt? All of these things, sociolinguistics, lots of fun. Pragmatics is a neat field. Pragmatists look at the apparent disconnect from the literal meaning of words and sentences and the way that they're used practically. How is there a disconnect there, and how can we understand that disconnect in the face of the fact that even though people don't mean what they literally say, people understand them? So how do we get there? Pragmatists look at patterns there and try to unpack that. Lots of other stuff. Language technology, getting computers to do languagey things like understanding text online. So when you search for this, it knows to match things that say that. How do you get a computer to speak and sound natural? How do you get a computer to understand you and make as few errors as possible when it's, say, transcribing or automatically creating closed captions for a video on YouTube, say? Lots of fun stuff. And you can probably imagine from these different careers that you can get. There are speech therapists, there are people who work in language technology, audiologists, language teachers, people who need to learn a language for their work, whether they're a translator or a salesperson working internationally or whatever, right? Lots of interesting jobs. And of course the best job of all, which is teaching linguistics. Yes. All right. So we're gonna look at all of the 5 main modules. These other fields that I've just mentioned, we're not going to talk about them directly or in depth. Those are the subject matter of Linguistics 102. But you'll certainly see, I think, along the way how what we're learning might touch on this or that different application. And feel free to ask as we go. Before I close, here's an exercise for you to do to see, just sort of consolidate these initial fun little bits that you're learning. So here's your task after this video. Go out into the wild and see if you can identify some claims about language. First of all, find claims about language and then identify which of the 5 modules they sort of slot into or address. And by going out into the wild, I mean anywhere outside of discussion of formal linguistics. So don't go look in a semantics textbook or a phonetics forum online, but listen to people talking about language around you. Read about it online in casual, Twitter discussions or Facebook or whatever. Find a claim, something that a person says or writes about language in general or about a particular language, and then ask yourself, is this person making a phonetic claim or asking a phonetic question? Are they making a semantic or phonological or morphological or syntactic claim? Right. Or maybe, it's possible that they're talking about more than one at a time. And if that's too easy for you, that seems like that's a fairly straightforward task. The 2 most difficult to tease apart at this stage of the 5 fields are phonetics, which is about the physical facts of language, and phonology, which is about patterns of sounds. So look up a claim about pronunciation of English, pronunciation of some other language, and see if you can tell whether it's a claim about phonetics or a claim about phonology, or maybe both. And if it's both, try to tease apart what is it saying phonetically and what is it saying phonologically. Let's see where you get with that. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.